Fate never promised to be fair, and for Ivy Thompson, it had been nothing but cruel. At 28, she had already lived through more pain than most people experience in a lifetime. Orphaned at 5, abused in foster care, betrayed by the only man she ever trusted, and now drowning in debt that could bury her forever. Tonight was supposed to be just another 16-hour shift at a rundown diner on the outskirts of Chicago, scrubbing grease stains and praying her body would not collapse from exhaustion. But when she stepped into the howling blizzard and found a 6-year-old boy in a cashmere coat dying behind a dumpster, everything shattered. She did not know that the child she was cradling in her frozen arms was the only heir to the Corsetti Empire, the most ruthless criminal dynasty in the Midwest. She did not know that saving his life would paint a target on her back and drag her into a world of bullets, blood, and betrayal. And she certainly did not know that this one act of kindness would bring a man into her broken life who could either destroy what little she had left or become the only reason she had to keep breathing. This is the story of how a shattered heart saved a frozen soul, and how a single night in a blizzard started a war. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a good Mafia romance. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next twist. Now, let us find out what happens when the king of the underworld meets the woman who saved his son. Ivy didn't think. She acted. Her hands slid under the small body of the boy, feeling the frightening weight of a child who didn't move. He was lighter than she expected. Yet in the howling snowstorm with winds over 60 kilometers an hour, every step felt like dragging a slab of stone. She pressed him tight against her chest, trying to pass the last scraps of warmth from her exhausted body into his. Her thin coat was soaked through and clung to her skin like a second layer of ice. But she didn't care. All she cared about was the faint breath against her neck, the only proof he was still alive. Ivy staggered through the dark alley, her torn canvas shoes slipping on the ice. She fell. Her knees slammed into concrete hard as rock and pain shot up her spine. But she didn't let go of him. She would never let go. She forced herself up, clenched her teeth, and kept going toward the battered 2003 model car, parked in the corner of the staff lot. The only thing she owned that had any value, if a pile of rusted metal with a dying engine could be called valuable. She yanked open the back door, laid the boy on the seat, and pulled off her wet coat to cover him. She had nothing left to keep herself warm. Her thin diner uniform stuck to her body, so cold she could no longer feel her fingers. But that didn't matter. She jumped into the driver's seat, shoved the key in, and turned it. Nothing. She turned it again. The engine whimpered and died. No, not now. Ivy slammed her fist against the wheel, tears spilling and mixing with melting snow on her face. She looked in the mirror and saw the boy lying still. Lips blue, chest barely moving. He was dying. Right in front of her he was dying, and the damn car wouldn't start. She begged, her voice shaking and breaking in the dark. Please, please. She'd do anything. She'd work as many extra shifts as it took. She'd go hungry as many days as it took. Just let this car start. Just once. She turned the key one last time, pressed the gas, and as if someone above had heard her desperate prayer, the engine roared to life. Ivy didn't wait a second. She floored it, and the car shot out of the lot like a bullet. The blizzard turned everything white. Visibility was less than 10 meters. But she didn't slow down. She drove like something was chasing her. Through the first intersection, red light, she went straight through. Horns screamed somewhere in the snow. She didn't care. Through the second, a refrigerated truck burst in from the right. Ivy yanked the wheel. The car skidded on the ice, spun 180 degrees before she fought it back under control. Her heart hammered like it would tear out of her chest. But she didn't stop. She checked the mirror again. The boy was still breathing. Still breathing. She wouldn't let him die. She refused to let him die. She'd seen too much death in her life. Her parents, Martha. She wouldn't add another name to that list. Especially not an innocent child who hadn't even lived yet. The third red light. She ran it. A police siren wailed behind her. She didn't stop. They could arrest her after she got him to the hospital. But there was one thing Ivy didn't notice in her panic. Behind her, about 50 meters back, a black SUV with tinted windows was following. No lights, no siren, just moving silently through the storm like a ghost tracking the old car ahead. Inside the SUV, a man lifted his phone, his voice cold as ice. They found the boy. A woman is taking him to St. Mary's Hospital. Inform the boss. The red glow of the St. Mary's emergency sign appeared through the whiteout like a lighthouse in a storm. Ivy pressed the gas one last time. The car lunged straight into the ambulance bay, braking so hard the tires shrieked on the frozen ground. She didn't turn off the engine. She didn't close the door. She just ran, yanked open the back door, grabbed the boy, and ran. Ran as if her own life depended on every second. The glass doors of the emergency room slid open, and Ivy burst inside like a storm. "Help him, please. Someone help him." Her voice broke, raw and desperate, and she barely recognized it as her own. It sounded like the cry of a wounded animal, wild and in pain. "He can't breathe. Please. He's dying." The waiting room froze for a heartbeat. Eyes turned toward the drenched woman holding a motionless child. Then everything moved. A nurse shouted for a doctor. 2 others rushed in with a gurney. A doctor in green scrubs came running through the double doors, his eyes taking in the situation at once. "Put him here," the doctor said, calm but urgent. "What's his condition?" Ivy laid the boy on the gurney, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. "I found him in the blizzard. I don't know how long he's been there. He's hypothermic, high fever, barely breathing." The words spilled out of her like a flood. The doctor nodded, placed his stethoscope on the boy's chest, checked his pupils. His face flickered for a split second before returning to professional calm. "Prep the resuscitation room. Start warm fluids immediately. Call the pediatrician on duty." The gurney began to roll away. Ivy stepped after it, instinct driving her not to leave him. But a nurse stopped her, hands gentle but firm on her shoulders. "You have to stay here. We'll take care of him." "No." Ivy shook her head, trying to get past. "He has no one. He's all alone. I can't leave him alone. We'll take care of him," the nurse repeated more softly. "You saved him. Now let us do our part." The double doors swung shut. Ivy stood there, staring through the small window, watching the boy being pushed farther and farther away until he vanished around a corner. Then she collapsed, not unconscious, just her legs finally refusing to hold her another second. She slid down the cold wall and sat on the shiny linoleum floor, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself. She was cold, cold to the bone. Her thin uniform clung to her like a second skin, water from her hair dripping into a small puddle on the floor. Her teeth chattered, her whole body shaking beyond her control. A nurse brought her a blanket and a cup of hot coffee. She took them with numb hands but didn't drink. She just sat there, staring at the double doors, waiting. The waiting room was quiet at this hour, only the hum of the vending machine and the howl of the wind beyond the glass. Now and then footsteps passed by, but no one stopped to tell her anything. Ivy didn't know how much time passed. 10 minutes? 20 minutes? Maybe an hour? She didn't know. She only knew she was praying. She wasn't someone who prayed. Life had taught her that if there was a God, he'd abandoned her long ago. But tonight, in this cold emergency room, she prayed. For a child she didn't know. For a small life she'd found by chance in a storm. She prayed because it was the only thing she could do. And while she sat there, lost in worry and exhaustion, she didn't know the hospital doors were about to open. She didn't know that in 10 minutes her life would change forever. And she certainly didn't know whether the man about to walk through that door was a devil or an angel in disguise. The hospital's automatic doors slid open, and the air in the waiting room changed at once. Ivy felt it before she saw anything, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped another 10 degrees, as if the very air she breathed had grown thick and heavy. She lifted her head and her heart skipped. 6 men entered. No, they didn't enter. They occupied the space. 5 of them in black suits, moving with the frightening synchrony of men trained to kill. Their eyes swept the room like radar, mapping every corner, every exit, every possible threat, their hands poised where weapons could be drawn at any moment. But the one who made Ivy stop breathing wasn't the guards. It was the man in the center. He was taller than all the others by at least half a head, probably over 1.90 meters, with broad shoulders tight beneath a charcoal cashmere coat. His hair was black as ink, slicked back to reveal a face carved from marble and shadow. Angular, cold, terrifyingly perfect. A faint scar ran along his left cheekbone like a silent reminder that this man was no stranger to violence. But the most frightening thing was his eyes. Steel gray, like a storm sky, like ash from something that had burned to nothing. There was no warmth there, no mercy, only cold calculation and absolute power. He didn't walk, he hunted. Every step was a declaration, every glance a threat. The entire room froze. The receptionist stopped typing with her hands suspended in midair. The security guard swallowed and looked at the floor, pretending to check his phone. A patient waiting nearby hurriedly stood and pulled his wife as far away as possible. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loudly, because everyone in Chicago knew that face. Maybe they'd never met him, but they knew. Rumors spread like fire through dark alleys and damp bars. Vincent Corsetti, the head of the Corsetti Empire, the man who controlled everything from the docks to the construction unions, from underground casinos to deals, the police never dared investigate. They said he could make someone disappear without a trace. They said he killed his first man at 16. They said if you ever saw Vincent Corsetti, either you were about to die or you wished you already had. Where is my son? His voice rang out, low and cold, not loud yet somehow filling the room. It wasn't a question. It was an order. The receptionist opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She coughed and tried again. Sir, I need to know who you are and the patient's name. Vincent didn't look at her. He didn't need to. One of the guards stepped forward and placed a business card on the counter. Nothing more. No explanation. But the receptionist looked at it and her face drained white. The boy, she said quickly, fingers trembling on the keyboard. About 6 years old. Hypothermia. Brought in about 20 minutes ago. He's in intensive care. Dr. Hayes is in charge. Stable. He's stable, Mr. Corsetti. For the first time, something shifted in Vincent's face. Not softness, not a smile. Just the faintest flash of relief in those steel eyes, like a ray of light through a crack in stone. And then it was gone. Who brought my son here? Vincent asked, his voice still cold. The receptionist looked around, and her gaze landed on Ivy. The drenched girl curled on the floor, wrapped in a hospital blanket like a stray cat pulled from a gutter. Her, she said, pointing at Ivy. She brought the boy in. Vincent turned, his gray eyes locked onto Ivy. And in that moment Ivy felt as if she were being seen to the bone, as if every secret, every fear, every wound she hid was laid bare under that gaze. She wanted to look away. She wanted to disappear, but something in her, the thing that had carried her through 28 years of hell, refused to bow. Vincent Corsetti started toward her, and Ivy knew that even though she'd saved his son, that didn't mean she was safe. She might have just stepped into a storm far more dangerous than the one outside. Vincent Corsetti stopped less than a meter from Ivy. From this distance, she could smell the faint trace of expensive cologne on him, could see every perfect thread in his cashmere coat, could feel the weight of power pressing down on her like an invisible stone. He looked down at her, and Ivy looked up at him, a soaked waitress sitting on a hospital floor facing the most powerful mafia boss in the Midwest. The contrast was so absurd, it was almost funny if her heart weren't hammering like it was about to explode. "Stand up," Vincent said. Not a request, but a command. Ivy swallowed, every cell in her body screaming at her to bow, to obey, to do whatever this man wanted if she wanted to live. But something deep in her, forged through 28 years of being knocked down and standing back up, refused to submit. She stood, slowly, painfully, not because he ordered it, but because she chose to stand. Her legs shook, her knees ached from the fall in the alley, but she straightened, lifted her chin, and met those cold gray eyes. Vincent watched her in silence, measuring, analyzing, as if she were a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be taken apart. His gaze traveled from her wet hanging hair to her pale, gaunt face with dark circles of sleeplessness, down to the cheap waitress uniform stained with grease, down to the torn canvas, shoes pooling water on the floor. She knew how she looked, wretched, pitiful, not worth a second of thought from someone like Vincent Corsetti. But she wasn't ashamed. She'd survived hell. She didn't need to be ashamed of her battle scars. "Where did you find my son?" Vincent asked, his voice empty of emotion. "In the alley behind the diner where I work," Ivy answered, her voice hoarse but steady. "He was lying behind the dumpster, hypothermic, barely breathing. And you decided to bring him to the hospital, not call the police, not call an ambulance? Drive yourself through the blizzard. Ambulances would take at least 45 minutes in this weather," Ivy said plainly. He didn't have 45 minutes. Something flickered through Vincent's eyes, too fast for Ivy to catch what it was. Then he reached into his inner pocket and took out a leather wallet. "You saved my son's life," Vincent said, opened the wallet and pulled out a thick wad of cash. "I'll repay you." "How much?" He tossed the money toward Ivy like throwing food to a hungry dog. 50,000, more than she made in a year. Ivy looked at the money in his hand. $50,000. Enough to pay a third of her debt. Enough to get her out of the damp basement apartment. Enough to buy her a few months without fearing eviction. All she had to do was reach out and take it. "No thank you," Ivy said, her voice clear in the waiting room silence. Vincent's guards exchanged startled looks. The receptionist's mouth fell open. Even Vincent paused. The money hanging in the air. For the first time since he'd entered the hospital, his perfect cold mask cracked, showing a flash of real surprise. "What did you just say?" I said no thank you, Ivy repeated. Her voice didn't shake. I didn't save the boy for money. I saved him because he was a child who was dying, and I was the only one there. Vincent drew the money back, his eyes narrowing as if Ivy were a creature he'd never seen before. Everyone has a price, he said slowly, each word measured. 100,000. I don't sell decency, Ivy replied. Not because she was noble, but because if she took the money, she'd be no different from those who'd used her all her life. And she'd rather starve than become like them. Silence fell, heavy and taut as a wire about to snap. Vincent looked at Ivy, and something in his gaze changed. No longer cold contempt, no longer empty appraisal, but something else. Something like curiosity, like reluctant respect for an unexpected opponent. You're the first person to refuse my money, Vincent said, his voice still cold but with something underneath. In 20 years, no one has ever said no to me. Then maybe you should meet more people, Ivy said, not knowing where that courage came from, or whether she was signing her own death warrant. One corner of Vincent's mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Brief as lightning. Interesting, he said. Just one word, but the way he said it made Ivy feel like she'd passed a test she never knew she was taking, and she didn't know whether that was good or bad. Vincent turned to one of his guards, the tall man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as razors. Investigate her, Vincent ordered, his voice allowing no argument. Everything, from the day she was born until now. I want to know who she is, what she does, who she knows, and find out what happened to my son, who dared to touch him. The guard nodded, pulled out his phone, and disappeared through the door. Vincent didn't look at Ivy again. He turned and walked toward the intensive care unit, his entourage following like shadows. The door closed, and Ivy was left alone in the waiting room, her heart still pounding, not knowing whether she'd just escaped death or dug her own grave. 3 hours later, in the most luxurious private room of the hospital that Vincent had demanded Mason be transferred to, the salt and pepper-haired guard returned with an iPad and a face hard to read. Report, Vincent said, his eyes never leaving Mason lying in the bed, his skin already pinker, his breathing steadier, though he still hadn't woken. The kidnapping, the guard began, his voice even like a military briefing. We checked the security cameras along the route. The boy was taken while walking home from school, about 3 blocks from the estate. 2 attackers, driving a white van, no plates. They took him to an abandoned warehouse in the southern industrial zone. Who's behind it? Vincent asked. Not confirmed yet, but based on the method, we suspect the Russians. Volkov, we're investigating further. Vincent said nothing, but his jaw tightened hard enough that the grind of his teeth could be heard. Nikolai Volkov, the name cut like a knife into an old wound. The Corsetti family's sworn enemy, head of the Russian Mafia empire in the Midwest. The man who'd tried again and again to overthrow Vincent and never succeeded, until now. Continue, Vincent ordered, his voice colder than ice. The boy escaped, the guard said, and there was something like admiration in his tone. We don't know how, but a camera near the warehouse caught him running out around 7 in the evening. He ran through the blizzard for almost 3 hours before reaching the alley behind the diner where the woman found him. Vincent closed his eyes. 3 hours. His son, 6 years old, had run through a -15-degree blizzard for 3 hours, alone, terrified, with no one to help him. He could have died. If not for that thin waitress with the stubborn eyes, Mason would be dead. And the woman? Vincent asked, opening his eyes. Ivy Thompson, 28 years old, orphaned at 5 when her parents died in a car accident. Raised in the foster system, moved through 12 different facilities over 13 years. Reports of abuse in at least 3 of them. At 18, she aged out and lived on the streets for nearly a year before being informally taken in by an older woman named Martha Collins. Martha Collins died 2 years ago of late-stage cancer, leaving hospital debt of $150,000 that Ivy Thompson is trying to pay. The guard paused and flipped to another page. She was also scammed by a former boyfriend and lost another $30,000 in savings. She's currently working at the Rusty Spoon Diner. 16-hour shifts, minimum wage. Lives in a windowless basement apartment. Rent 2 months overdue. Medical records show severe anemia from malnutrition. She's fainted at least 3 times in the past month but hasn't seen a doctor because she can't afford it. Vincent was silent. He'd seen many broken people in his life. People who sold their souls for a few small bills. People willing to betray their own parents to climb the ladder of power. But this woman, drowning in debt and illness, owning nothing but a rusted car and a grease-stained uniform, had refused $50,000 without hesitation. Either she was the biggest fool he'd ever met, or she was a person with a kind of dignity he'd thought extinct long ago. "Sir?" the guard said, his tone a little different. "There's one more thing." "What?" Vincent asked. "The boy woke up 15 minutes ago." Vincent rose at once and turned toward the bed. Mason's eyes were open, the same gray as his father's, looking at Vincent. But the boy didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since his mother died nearly 3 years earlier. The doctors called it selective mutism, from psychological trauma. Vincent had hired dozens of specialists, spent millions, but no one had made his son open his mouth. Mason lifted his hand, and Vincent saw he was holding a pen and a piece of paper. This was the first time in 3 years the boy had initiated communication. Vincent stepped closer, took the paper, and his heart, the heart he'd thought had turned to stone long ago, suddenly clenched. On the paper, in the clumsy writing of a 6-year-old, were only 3 words. She was warm. Vincent looked at the paper, then at his son, then out the window. Somewhere in this hospital, a drenched waitress was sitting alone, not knowing she'd just done what dozens of the world's top experts had failed to do. She'd made Mason Corsetti want to reach back to the world. 2 days later, Ivy went back to work as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just saved the son of a mafia boss, as if she hadn't just refused $50,000 she needed badly enough to die for it. Life didn't allow her the luxury of thinking about any of that. Rent still had to be paid. Debts were still piling up, and her body was still so exhausted she had to cling to the counter to keep from collapsing in the middle of her shift. Frank, the diner owner, didn't even ask why she'd been gone that night. He just docked her a day's pay and shouted at her to work faster. Ivy didn't argue. She didn't have the strength. She lowered her head, wiped tables, poured coffee, smiled at rude customers, and tried not to faint. That was her life. That was all she knew. Then the diner door opened, and everything changed. Ivy heard the silence before she saw anything. The rusty spoon was always loud with workers' laughter, clattering cutlery, cheap music from an old speaker. But now it all stopped. Ivy lifted her head from the table she was wiping, and her heart stopped. 3 black SUVs were parked outside, filling the street, and stepping through the door in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit was Vincent Corsetti. Frank, who was always shouting and bullying the staff, suddenly turned into a trembling mouse. He rushed out from behind the counter, face red, sweat pouring. Mr. Corsetti," he stammered, voice shaking. "Can I help you?" "Her," Vincent said without looking at Frank, gray eyes locked on Ivy. "I need to speak to her." Frank turned to Ivy, fear and curiosity in his eyes. "Ivy, do you know Mr. Corsetti?" Ivy didn't answer. She set the cloth down, walked toward Vincent, forcing her legs not to shake. She didn't know why he was here or what he wanted, but she knew running was useless. A man like Vincent Corsetti would find her anywhere. "Outside," Vincent said. And it wasn't a request. Ivy followed him out into the cold winter afternoon. The snow had stopped, but the temperature was still below -10. Ivy wore only her thin uniform, but she didn't let him see that she was cold. She wouldn't show him any weakness. Vincent looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he took a small piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Ivy took it, and her throat tightened. It was the scrap of paper with a child's clumsy writing. She was warm. "My son hasn't spoken since his mother died," Vincent said, his voice still cold but with something beneath it. "Almost 3 years. Doctors, psychologists, the best therapists in the world, none of them could do anything. But after meeting you, for the first time in 3 years he wanted to communicate." Ivy looked at the paper, not knowing what to say. She remembered the freezing boy in her arms, the way she'd held him tight to give him warmth, the words she'd whispered to him all the way to the hospital. "Don't give up. I won't leave you. You'll be fine. I have a proposal," Vincent said. "I need a caregiver for my son. Not an ordinary one. I need someone he trusts. Someone who makes him want to open up. You're the only person who's done that in 3 years." Ivy opened her mouth to refuse, but Vincent raised a hand to stop her. $15,000 a month. Erase all your debt, including hospital bills and rent. Full medical care, including treatment for your anemia and anything else. You'll live in my estate, have your own room, everything you need. Ivy stood there, unable to believe what she was hearing. That money, those conditions, it was a dream, something she'd never even dared imagine. "But who are you?" Ivy asked, her voice faintly trembling. "I know who you are. I've heard the rumors. You're..." She didn't finish, but Vincent understood. "I'm a criminal," he said plainly. "I run the empire. My father left me. I do things you don't want to know about. I have enemies, many enemies, people who'd do anything to bring me down. Living in my world is dangerous." He stepped closer, gray eyes fixed on hers. but I'm also a father, and I'll do anything to make my son happy. Anything. I can't. Ivy shook her head, even though every cell in her body was screaming at her to accept. Your world isn't for me. I don't belong there. Vincent didn't get angry. He didn't threaten. He just looked at her with a gaze Ivy couldn't read. 24 hours, he said. I'll give you 24 hours to think. Here's my card. When you decide, call me. He placed the black card with silver letters in her hand and turned away. Before getting into the car, he paused and added one last thing. And Miss Thompson, remember this. In my world, there's danger, but there's also protection. In your world, there's only slow death. The car door closed. The 3 SUVs slid away like ghosts. Ivy stood alone in the cold, holding the card, and for the first time in many years, she didn't know what to do. That night, Ivy returned to her basement apartment after a 16-hour shift. She unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped into the familiar cold darkness. There were no windows, no heater, only a sagging single bed, an old refrigerator groaning in the corner, and blotches of mold on the walls. This was her home. This was all she had after 28 years of existing in the world. Ivy didn't turn on the light. The electricity had been cut off a week earlier because she couldn't pay. She felt her way through the dark toward the bed. But her head began to spin. Bright spots danced before her eyes, and suddenly the floor rushed up at her. She didn't have time to reach out. She didn't have time to cry out. She just fell, her head striking the freezing concrete, and everything went black. When Ivy woke, she didn't know how much time had passed. An hour? 2? Maybe the whole night? She only knew she was lying face down on the floor, her cheek pressed to the ice-cold concrete, her body aching so badly she could barely move. She tried to push herself up, but her hands shook too much to hold her weight. She fell back and lay there gasping, staring into the dark. This was her life, working 16 hours a day, and still not earning enough to pay her debts, skipping meals to save every coin, and still being evicted, trying and trying and trying and still fainting alone on a cold floor with no one knowing, no one caring. If she died here tonight, how long would it take before anyone noticed? A week, 2 weeks, maybe a month. The landlord would only come when the rent was too overdue. Frank would only be angry she hadn't come to work. No one would cry for her. No one would remember her. She would disappear from the world as if she'd never existed. Tears spilled from her eyes and ran along her temple onto the concrete. Ivy cried. Not in sobs, but in the silent, desperate sound of someone who had reached the bottom. She'd fought for 28 years. She hadn't given up even when life kept knocking her down. But tonight on that cold floor, she had no strength left to fight. Then she remembered the card, the black card with silver letters. She'd slipped into her pocket that afternoon. Ivy felt for it in the dark and found it. She couldn't see it, but she felt the smooth, expensive paper under her fingers. In my world, there's danger, but there's also protection. In your world, there's only slow death. Vincent's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she couldn't deny the truth in them. She was dying. Slowly, painfully, day by day. Anemia, malnutrition, exhaustion. Her body was giving up even as her will still tried to fight. If she kept going like this, she wouldn't live to see 30. But if she accepted Vincent's offer, at least she had a chance. Dangerous, but still a chance. And she'd survived hell. She could survive anything. With the last of her strength, Ivy crawled to the small table where she kept her phone. She reached it. The screen flared bright in the dark. 3% battery. Enough for one call. She dialed the number on the card, lifted the phone to her ear, and waited. 1 ring, 2. Then the low, cold voice answered. Miss Thompson, Vincent said as if he'd been waiting for this call. I accept the job, Ivy said, her voice hoarse and weak. Silence for a second. Then Vincent replied with just 2 words. A car will pick you up at 8 tomorrow morning. The call ended. Ivy let the phone fall, lay back on the floor, and for the first time in many years she felt something like hope. Fragile, frightening, but still hope. At exactly 8 in the morning, a glossy black Mercedes stopped in front of Ivy's basement apartment. She'd been awake since 6, packing the few things she owned into a frayed old backpack. It didn't take long. A few clothes, a photo of Martha, the old book Martha used to read to her before bed. That was all she had after 28 years of living. The driver opened the door without a word. Ivy slid into the back seat, the scent of real leather and expensive wood filling the space. The car was probably worth more than the apartment she'd just left. No, it was definitely worth more. They drove out of the slum where Ivy lived, through the busy streets of downtown Chicago, then headed north toward the suburbs. The scenery changed. Gray apartment blocks gave way to mansions with vast lawns. Tall iron fences, security gates with cameras everywhere. This was the world of the rich and powerful, a world Ivy had never set foot in. Then the car stopped before a massive iron gate carved with an ornate C. The gate slowly opened and Ivy held her breath. The Corsetti estate appeared like a castle out of legend. No, not a legend, like a fortress from medieval times. The main building had at least 3 floors of gray stone with towering windows. Wings stretched out on either side like arms embracing the front garden. A marble fountain stood at the center of the drive. Armed guards at every corner scanned the car as it passed. Ivy swallowed. She'd known Vincent Corsetti was rich, but she hadn't known he was this rich. The car stopped at the front door. The driver opened it and Ivy stepped out, feeling like a small fish dropped into the ocean. Before she could gather herself, the great doors opened, and an older man stepped out. Maybe 55. Silver hair slicked neatly back, wearing a flawless black suit. But what surprised Ivy was his smile. Warm, genuine, utterly unlike the coldness she'd seen in Vincent and his guards. "Miss Thompson," he said politely. "I'm Marcus, the estate's butler. Mr. Corsetti has informed me of your arrival." "Welcome to the Corsetti home?" Ivy didn't know what to say. It had been a long time since anyone had welcomed her with kindness. She only nodded shyly, clutching her old backpack like a lifeline. Marcus led her inside, and Ivy was overwhelmed again. The main hall was vast with a high ceiling, crystal chandeliers, a grand marble staircase curving upward, oil paintings on the walls, fresh flowers in every corner. Wealth radiated from everything almost to the point of obscenity. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, the same floor as young Master Mason," Marcus said as they crossed the hall. "Mr. Corsetti wants you close to him for convenience. I'll take you up first." And then, he didn't finish before a woman's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. "So this is the new nanny." Ivy turned. A woman was descending the stairs, maybe 32, with long, glossy black hair and a face so sharply beautiful, it was almost frightening. She wore a tight red dress, every step radiating arrogance and power, but the most frightening thing was her eyes, dark brown, cold, scanning Ivy with open contempt. "This is Miss Serena Corsetti, the boss's cousin," Marcus introduced, his tone turning a little drier, as if trying to stay neutral. "Miss Serena, this is Miss Ivy Thompson, young Master Mason's new nanny." Serena stopped too close to Ivy, deliberately invading her space. Her expensive perfume so strong Ivy wanted to step back, but she didn't. She wouldn't retreat. "So you're the one who saved Mason in the blizzard," Serena said sweetly, fake sweet. "My cousin seems very impressed with you." Ivy didn't know how to reply, and she didn't have to. Serena leaned closer, lowering her voice so only Ivy could hear. "I hope you know your place, waitress. This is the Corsetti estate, not the cheap diner where you work. There are things here that don't belong to you and people you shouldn't get close to." Then she stepped back and smiled brightly as if she'd just said something pleasant. "Enjoy your work, Miss Thompson." Serena turned and walked away, heels clicking on the marble. Marcus watched her go, then looked back at Ivy. "Don't mind Miss Serena," he said gently. "She just needs time to get used to new people." Ivy said nothing, but she knew that wasn't true. Serena didn't need time. Serena had marked her as an enemy from the first second, and Ivy didn't know why. "Come along," Marcus said, leading her up the stairs. "Young Master Mason is waiting for you." Marcus stopped before an oak door at the end of the 2nd floor hallway. He knocked twice softly and then pushed it open. "This is young Master Mason's room," he said gently. "The boy has been told you're coming." Ivy stepped inside and her heart tightened. The room was as large as the basement apartment she'd once lived in. The walls were painted pale blue with delicate white clouds. Shelves rose to the ceiling filled with children's books and toys, a big bed with superhero sheets, remote control cars, expensive Lego sets, stuffed animals of every size, the latest game console, toys everywhere. Enough to open a shop, but in the middle of all that luxury, Mason sat alone by the window, arms wrapped around his knees, looking out at the snow-covered garden. He didn't touch any toys. He didn't read any books. He just sat there small and alone like an island in an ocean of meaningless things. Ivy understood at once. She'd been that child. Not in a room full of toys, but in a cold orphanage, sitting alone by a window, wondering why no one wanted her. "Could you leave me alone with him?" Ivy said to Marcus, her voice gentle but firm. Marcus looked at her a moment, then nodded and left, the door closing softly. Ivy didn't go to Mason. She didn't call his name. She didn't ask if he remembered her. Instead, she noticed a small corner with drawing paper and crayons. She went there, sat on the floor, took a blank sheet, and began to draw. She didn't know what she was drawing. She just let her hand move, blue and white, wandering lines without shape. The The room was so quiet she could hear the crayon on paper. Ivy didn't look toward Mason. She didn't push. She just sat and drew as if perfectly comfortable with the silence, as if she didn't need any response. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. Ivy kept drawing. Then she heard a sound. Light, hesitant. Small footsteps on the carpet. She didn't look up. She kept drawing, kept her breathing even, showed no sign she'd noticed him move. Mason stopped a few steps away. Ivy still didn't look up. She only slid the box of crayons toward him like a wordless invitation. Silence stretched another minute. Then she heard the soft rustle of someone sitting down beside her, the sound of a small hand taking a crayon. Ivy smiled, but still didn't look up. She kept drawing, and beside her Mason began to draw too. They sat that way in silence, two strangers, a grown woman and a child, coloring on blank paper together. No pressure, no expectation, just presence. And sometimes that's all a lonely child needs. Almost an hour later, Mason set his crayon down. Ivy felt his eyes on her, and this time, she looked up. Mason was holding his picture out to her, gray eyes like his father's waiting for something. Ivy took the picture and her breath caught. On the page, in the clumsy lines of a 6-year-old, were two figures, a grown person and a child, the grown one holding the child in her arms. Around them, white dotted marks Ivy knew were snow, and above them, in bright yellow, a circle. The sun, or maybe light, or maybe hope. Ivy couldn't speak. She looked at the drawing, then at Mason, and tears came before she could stop them. She remembered the blizzard night, the biting cold, the dying boy in her arms, and how she'd told him she wouldn't leave him alone. "It's beautiful," Ivy whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the most beautiful picture I've ever seen." Mason didn't speak. He couldn't. But for the first time since Ivy met him, his lips curved into a small smile, and in that moment, Ivy knew she'd made the right choice. Even if this world was dangerous, even if Serena hated her, even if the future was uncertain, she belonged here beside this lonely child. 2 weeks passed like a dream. Every day Ivy woke in her clean, spacious room, ate nourishing meals she hadn't had in years, and spent most of her time with Mason. They drew, they read, they built Lego castles, they played hide-and-seek in the vast garden, and little by little Mason began to change. He no longer sat alone by the window. He started looking for Ivy whenever she left the room, gray eyes following her with anxious focus until she returned. He began holding her hand when they walked in the garden, small fingers gripping tight as if afraid she'd vanish. And most importantly, he began to smile. Not often, not much, but enough for Ivy to know something was thawing inside him, something that had been frozen for 3 years. Vincent watched it all from a distance. From his office window, he could see the garden where Ivy and Mason were chasing each other. He watched his son laugh, watched the boy run after the dark-haired woman with a joy he'd thought lost forever, and something in his chest ached. 3 years. It had been 3 years since that day, the day everything changed, the day Isabella died. Vincent closed his eyes and memory crashed over him like a wave. It had been Mason's birthday, the boy turning 3. Isabella had thrown a small party in the garden with balloons and cake and laughter. Vincent remembered his wife's smile, bright as sunlight, as she lifted Mason and sang him happy birthday. He remembered thinking how perfect life was. Then the bullet came. No warning shot, no sign, just a sharp crack, and Isabella fell, blood staining her white dress, staining the green lawn, staining Vincent's whole world. Mason had been in his mother's arms when she was shot. The 3-year-old had seen it all, felt her body collapse, heard her final breath leave her before her eyes closed forever. Vincent had rushed forward, pulled Mason from her body, held his son while shouting orders, but it was too late. Isabella was dead, and Mason, the lively, talkative child, hadn't spoken a single word since. Doctors called it selective mutism from trauma. They said the shock had made his brain refuse speech as a defense. They said with time and therapy he might recover. But 3 years passed. Dozens of specialists came and went. Millions were spent. And Mason remained silent until Ivy appeared. Vincent opened his eyes and looked back down at the garden. Ivy sat on the grass with Mason curled in her lap, his head against her shoulder as she read to him. The sight stole Vincent's breath. Not because it was beautiful, but because it hurt in how much it resembled what he'd lost. Isabella had sat like that, held Mason like that, read to him like that, but Isabella was gone, and the woman there wasn't his wife but a waitress from the slums, with nothing but kindness and astonishing resilience. The woman who'd saved his son not once but twice, once in the blizzard and again by pulling him from the darkness of silence. "Sir," Marcus's voice came from behind. Vincent didn't turn. "What?" Miss Thompson is asking if she may take young Master Mason to the park this weekend. Vincent was silent a long moment. Aloud, he said at last, but at least 4 guards must go with them. And he didn't say what twisted deep inside him. That he wanted to go too. That he wanted to be with his son the way Ivy was. But every time he got close to Mason, he saw Isabella in his eyes, and the grief he'd buried for 3 years surged back like a tide and drowned him. He was Vincent Corsetti. He could face any enemy in the world, but he couldn't face his own pain. Serena Corsetti stood by her bedroom window, looking down at the garden where Ivy and Mason were playing, her dark brown eyes narrowing into slits of hatred as she watched her nephew smile. His first smile in 3 years, and that smile wasn't for her. It was for the intruder, the cheap waitress from the slums. Serena ground her teeth, red painted nails scraping against the window frame as if she wanted to tear something apart. She'd been in this estate for 3 years. She'd cared for Mason when no one else had. She'd hoped that in time Vincent would see her value, would trust her, would let her stand beside him as a true partner in the Corsetti empire. But now a girl from nowhere had taken everything. Vincent looked at Ivy with a gaze he'd never given Serena. Mason loved Ivy in a way he'd never loved Serena. Even Marcus, the old strict butler, treated Ivy with a respect it had taken Serena years to earn. It was unacceptable, and Serena wouldn't allow it to continue. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a number without a name. Only a symbol, a red star. She hesitated for a second because what she was about to do was betrayal and a death sentence if Vincent ever found out. But she had no choice. If she wanted power, she had to take it. She pressed call. 2 rings, and then a low voice with a Russian edge answered. "Serena, how unexpected. I thought you'd forgotten my number." "Nikolai," Serena said softly, almost whispering. "I need to see you." A pause then, a quiet laugh. "So you finally decided to call. Let me guess, something's happening in the Corsetti estate that you're not happy about." "There's a woman," Serena said bitterly. "A cheap waitress. She's bewitched Vincent and Mason. She's taking my place, and you want me to remove her," Nikolai said slowly. "In exchange for what?" Serena drew a deep breath. "Information. I'll tell you everything about the estate. Vincent's schedule, the weak points in the security system, and when you bring my cousin down, I want a share of the empire. A proper share." Nikolai Volkov laughed, the sound cold as winter wind. "You know, Serena, I always thought the Corsetti family had a loyalty problem. Now I have proof. Very well, we can work together. But I want more than information. I want the boy, Mason." Serena hesitated. "You want to kidnap Mason?" "Last time failed. Last time I didn't have someone on the inside," Nikolai replied calmly. "This time is different. You'll help me get the boy out of the estate, and when I have a hostage, Vincent will kneel." Serena swallowed. She hated Ivy and she wanted power, but Mason was her blood. Her cousin's son. Could she really do this? "Think about it," Nikolai said, as if reading her doubt. "Call me when you're ready and don't take too long. My patience is limited." The call ended and Serena stood there with the phone still to her ear, her heart racing. She'd crossed a line she couldn't return from, and she didn't know she wasn't alone. Outside her room in the dark hallway, Ivy stood frozen, back against the wall, barely breathing. She'd been passing by on her way back after putting Mason to bed. She'd heard Serena's voice through the half-open door, and she'd heard enough. Serena was betraying Vincent. Serena was working with the enemy. Serena was planning to hurt Mason. Ivy's heart pounded. What could she do? Tell Vincent, but who would believe her? A new waitress against the Mafia boss's cousin. Serena would twist it. Serena would blame her. Serena would. Footsteps sounded inside the room. Serena was coming out. Ivy turned and slipped away into the darkness as fast as she could, heart pounding so loud she feared Serena might hear it. She reached her room, closed the door, leaned against the wood and tried to steady herself. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let anyone hurt Mason, even if she had to face Serena, even if she had to face the whole world. In the days that followed, Ivy lived in a constant state of tension. She knew Serena's secret. She knew danger was waiting, but she didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Every time she saw Serena, her heart raced. Every time Serena came near Mason, she had to restrain herself from rushing in to shield him. She needed proof. She needed time. And ironically, it was during this tense period that Vincent began to change. One evening, as Ivy was about to take Mason to dinner in the staff dining room, as usual, Marcus appeared with an unexpected message. "The master wants you and young Master Mason to dine with him in the main dining room." Ivy thought she'd misheard. Vincent Corsetti, the ice-cold man who always ate alone, or not at all, wanted to eat with them. But she had no right to refuse. She took Mason by the hand to the main dining room where Vincent sat at the head of the table. His suit was replaced by a simple black shirt, making him a little less intimidating but still radiating power. Mason surprisingly wasn't afraid. He ran to sit beside his father, gray eyes lifted with something like hope. And Vincent, though his face stayed unreadable, lifted a hand and brushed his son's hair. A small gesture, but enough for Ivy to see that beneath the ice there was a heart trying to thaw. The first dinner passed in awkward silence. The second was a little easier. By the third, Vincent began asking Ivy about her days with Mason. She answered briefly and politely, not daring to cross lines. But the dinners turned into late-night talks. After Mason went to bed, Ivy often went down for a glass of water, and somehow Vincent was often there too. They sat across from each other at the kitchen island, a glass of wine in Vincent's hand, a glass of water in Ivy's, and they talked. About small things at first, the weather, Mason, the books Ivy read him, then gradually deeper. One night when moonlight slipped through the kitchen window and cast shadows on Vincent's face, he suddenly asked, "Have you ever lost someone you loved?" Ivy was quiet a moment, then nodded. "Martha, the woman who saved me from the streets. She died 2 years ago. Cancer." She paused and swallowed. "She was the only person who ever loved me without condition. When she died, I felt like a part of me died too." Vincent looked at her, and for the first time Ivy saw something else in those gray eyes. Not coldness, but understanding. The empathy of someone who'd lost too. "My mother was killed when I was 10, Vincent said, his voice low and distant, right in front of me. My father had many enemies, and one of them decided to send a message by shooting my mother in the head while she was taking me to school." Ivy couldn't speak. She only looked at him and saw the 10-year-old boy inside this frightening man. A boy who lost his mother, who grew up in violence and hatred, who became a monster because there was no other way to survive. And now Vincent continued, almost whispering, "My son had to witness the same thing. Isabella died in front of Mason, and I didn't protect her, just like I didn't protect my mother." Ivy reached out, and before she could think, she placed her hand over Vincent's. He startled, looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. "No one can control everything," Ivy said gently. "What matters is you're still here, still fighting for your son. Mason needs you." Vincent didn't answer, but he didn't pull his hand away either. They sat like that in silence, hands touching across the island, and for the first time the distance between them wasn't so wide. A few nights later, Ivy accidentally broke a glass while washing dishes. A shard cut into her palm, and blood welled bright red. She was trying to wrap it with paper towels when Vincent appeared. Without a word, he came over, took her hand, and examined the wound with frightening focus. "Sit down," he ordered, and Ivy obeyed without thinking. Vincent produced a small first aid kit and cleaned the cut with alcohol. So gently, Ivy barely felt pain. She watched him work, watched hands that had killed bind her wound with care as if she were something precious, and her heart skipped. "Be more careful next time," Vincent said without looking up. "I can't have the person who looks after my son getting hurt." But when he finished, he still didn't let go of her hand. He looked up, gray eyes meeting Ivy's brown, and in that moment, the air between them changed. Thick, heated, full of things unsaid. "Thank you," Ivy whispered, her voice rougher than usual. Vincent didn't answer. He only looked at her another second, then slowly released her and walked away, leaving Ivy alone in the kitchen with a chaotic heart and the clear knowledge that she was stepping into dangerous territory. Not danger from the Mafia world, but danger from what she was beginning to feel for Vincent Corsetti. Serena made her move on a morning that seemed ordinary like any other. Ivy was in Mason's room helping him change for breakfast when the door flew open and 2 guards stepped in, faces cold as stone. "Miss Thompson, you need to come with us," one of them said without emotion. "The boss wants to see you immediately." Ivy didn't understand what was happening, but she felt something was wrong from the way they looked at her, as if she were a criminal, as if she'd done something terrible. She took Mason's hand, tried to reassure him with her eyes, then followed the guards to Vincent's office. When she entered, she saw Vincent standing behind his desk, his face colder than usual, and beside him Serena stood with a perfectly crafted look of grief, tears streaming down her face, a diamond necklace glittering in her hand. Ivy recognized it at once. She'd seen it in the family jewelry room. It had belonged to Vincent's mother, the most precious heirloom of the collection. "Cousin, I found it in her room," Serena sobbed, pointing at Ivy, in her dresser drawer. "I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is clear. She's a thief." Ivy's heart sank. She understood at once what had happened. Serena had set her up, perfectly, without a flaw. "I didn't do it," Ivy said, her voice shaking but firm. "I've never touched anything that wasn't mine. The necklace was found in your room," Vincent said flatly. Unreadable. How do you explain that? I don't know how it got there. Someone put it there. Someone's framing me. Serena cried louder, covering her face. I knew this would happen. I warned you not to trust a stranger from the slums, but you didn't listen, and now she's stealing from our family. Vincent was silent, gray eyes fixed on Ivy. She didn't know who he believed. She didn't know what he'd do. She only knew everything she'd built in these weeks. Her bond with Mason, her moments with Vincent, was collapsing before her eyes. Then the office door opened again. Mason ran in, slipping past the guards trying to stop him, straight to Vincent. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but he was holding a piece of paper, lifting it up with pleading eyes. Vincent took the paper, and as he read it, his face changed. The cold vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous, icy rage. The rage of a predator who's just found a traitor. Ivy didn't know what Mason had written, but she saw Vincent look up at Serena, and there was no warmth left for his cousin. I saw Aunt Serena in Ivy's room this morning, Vincent read aloud, his voice cold as ice. I saw her open the drawer and put something inside. Serena went pale. The boy is lying, she stammered. He can't talk. He can write anything to protect that waitress. My son doesn't lie. Vincent cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. And my son hasn't written anything in 3 years until Ivy came. If he chose to write to protect someone, that person deserves protection. Silence fell heavy in the room. Serena trembled. Her mask of grief shattered, showing real panic. Cousin I was only trying to protect the family. Out, Vincent ordered. No room for argument. Everyone out except Ivy. The guards dragged Serena away. Marcus led Mason out, though the boy kept looking back at Ivy anxiously. When the door closed, only Ivy and Vincent remained. I'm sorry, Vincent said, the words seeming hard for him. I should have trusted you from the start. Ivy didn't answer. She was shaking, not with fear but with relief flooding her body. Vincent stepped closer, gray eyes holding something Ivy didn't dare name. Serena's planning something, he said quietly. I knew she had issues, but I didn't think she'd go this far. Now I need to find out who she's contacting and what she's planning. And Ivy realized this was her chance. I know, she said, steadier now. I heard her call someone a few days ago, a man named Nikolai. They're planning to kidnap Mason. Vincent stood perfectly still when he heard what Ivy said. Nikolai Volkov. The name struck him like a blade driven straight through his chest. The man who killed Isabella. The man who stole Mason's mother. The man Vincent had hunted for 3 years without ever finding proof enough to destroy. And now that man had an informant inside his own house, his own cousin. Tell me everything, Vincent said. His voice so cold the air in the room seemed to freeze. Every word. Don't leave anything out. Ivy told him everything. About the night she'd passed Serena's room by accident. About the phone call she'd overheard. About the plan to kidnap Mason. About Serena agreeing to be the inside woman in exchange for power. She hid nothing, even though she knew keeping the secret for days might anger him. When she finished, Vincent turned away, braced his hands on the desk, head bowed. You knew this for days, he said. His voice controlled, but Ivy could hear the fury boiling beneath. Why didn't you tell me at once? Because I had no proof, Ivy answered honestly. Because I'm a new waitress and Serena is your cousin. Who would have believed me? Vincent was silent for a long moment. Then he lifted his head and turned back to her. And for the first time, Ivy saw something else in his gray eyes. Not anger, but fear. Do you understand what this means? He asked, stepping closer. Nikolai knows you exist. He knows you matter to Mason. And now, after this failed frame-up, Serena will want you gone even more. You're in danger. Ivy didn't step back. I know. You need to leave, Vincent said, his voice an order that allowed no refusal. I have a safe house outside the city. No one knows about it. You'll take Mason there and stay until I deal with this. Ivy shook her head. No. No, Vincent repeated as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're refusing me. I'm saying I'm not running, Ivy said, her voice steady even as her heart thundered. I've run my whole life. From the orphanage, from abusers, from the past. I'm tired of running. You don't understand. Vincent stepped even closer, his eyes burning with anger, and something else Ivy didn't dare name. This isn't a game. This is Nikolai Volkov. He killed my wife. He won't hesitate to kill you. Then you need me here even more. Ivy replied, stepping forward instead of back. Mason needs me. And you need someone beside you right now. Vincent stopped less than a step from her, looked into her brown eyes blazing with resolve, and something inside him broke. Why? He asked, his voice suddenly rough. Why are you doing this? Why are you willing to stay when you could leave safely? Why do you care what happens to me? Because Mason needs his father, Ivy said gently. He's lost his mother. He can't lose you too. And because, she stopped, not daring to finish. Because what? Vincent asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Because I don't want to run anymore, Ivy confessed, the words escaping before she could stop them. For the first time in my life, I have somewhere I want to stay, someone I want to be with. Silence fell, heavy and taut as a wire about to snap. Vincent looked at her, and the last ice in his eyes melted. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, gently, as if she were something precious that could shatter. You're what I never knew I needed, he said, his voice faintly trembling. I've built walls around myself for so many years. I thought I didn't need anyone. I thought I could fight the world alone, and then you appeared out of a dark alley in a blizzard, and you broke every wall I built. Ivy felt tears rise. She didn't know she was crying until one slid down her cheek and touched Vincent's finger. I don't deserve this, she whispered. I'm just a waitress from the slums, and I'm a mafia boss with blood on my hands, Vincent replied, his thumb wiping away her tear. Maybe neither of us deserves it, or maybe that's why we belong together. He leaned down, forehead touching hers, their breaths mingling, but before their lips could meet, Vincent's phone rang, shattering the moment. Vincent closed his eyes, exhaled, stepped back, and answered. What? He listened, his face darkening. Understood. Prepare everything. Tonight. He ended the call and looked at Ivy, his eyes steel again. Serena just contacted Nikolai. They're attacking tonight. That night, the Corsetti estate sank into a false darkness. Vincent had ordered all the lights off, preparing the ambush. His men were positioned everywhere, hidden in the shadows, guns loaded, ready for battle. But Vincent made one mistake. He underestimated Serena's madness. He didn't expect his cousin to give Nikolai a detailed map of the entire security system, including blind spots even he'd forgotten. And he didn't know Serena had slipped out of her room at dusk and opened the back kitchen door in advance, where there were no cameras and no guards. 11 at night. Ivy was in Mason's room, sitting beside his bed, unable to sleep. Vincent had told her to stay there, lock the door, and not come out no matter what happened. But she couldn't sleep, knowing a battle was about to erupt somewhere outside. Mason wasn't asleep either. He lay curled beside her, gray eyes wide in the dark, small fingers gripping hers as if afraid she'd vanish. Ivy held him and softly sang a lullaby. Martha once sang to her, trying to hide the fear crushing her heart. Then the gunfire came. Not one shot, but many. Bullets cracked like fireworks. Tearing the night apart, Ivy sprang up, clutching Mason, retreating to the far corner of the room. Through the window she saw flashes in the dark, figures running, someone falling. The fight had begun and it wasn't going to plan. The gunfire drew closer. Screams, glass breaking, footsteps in the hall. Ivy scanned the room for something to use as a weapon. There was nothing but toys and children's books. She ran to the door and checked the lock. Still locked. But a wooden door wouldn't stop bullets. She remembered Vincent mentioning a secret room, an emergency exit built in his grandfather's time, the entrance behind the large mirror in Mason's dressing room. Ivy wasn't sure she could find it in the dark, but she had to try. Come on, sweetheart, she whispered, lifting Mason. We have to hide. Mason wrapped his arms around her neck, his body trembling but silent. He was used to being silent in fear, and it broke Ivy's heart. She rushed into the dressing room, set Mason down, and began feeling behind the mirror for the hidden mechanism. Her fingers traced every edge, every corner, searching for a latch or button. The gunfire outside was closer now. A bullet tore through Mason's window and glass exploded. Ivy covered Mason with her body, heart pounding. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Then she found it. A small catch hidden behind the frame. She pressed hard and the mirror swung open, revealing a black tunnel. Ivy lifted Mason, ready to dive into the dark, but she was too late. The dressing room door burst open. A flashlight beam blazed into her face, and standing there with a sly smile was Serena. Found them. Serena called back to 3 men in black with rifles. The kid and the waitress, just like Nikolai wanted. Ivy backed up, clutching Mason, her back to the wall, nowhere left to run. The secret door was behind her, but she couldn't open it without turning her back. Serena, Ivy said, her voice shaking but trying to stay calm. You're his cousin. Your family. How can you do this? Family. Serena laughed, cold and bitter. Family never gave me anything. I lived in Vincent's shadow for years, working, giving, waiting, and then a cheap waitress appears and steals everything that should have been mine. I didn't steal anything, Ivy said. He never belonged to you. Serena's smile vanished, eyes dark with hatred. Take them, she ordered. Nikolai wants them both. The men stepped forward. Ivy turned, trying to flee into the tunnel, but a hand grabbed her hair and yanked her back. She screamed, struggled, tried to shield Mason. But they were too strong. They tore Mason from her arms. He opened his mouth, and Ivy saw he was trying to scream, trying to call for someone. But no sound came out. 3 years of silence locked his voice, even when he needed it most. Miss Ivy, Miss Ivy. She read on his lips, and her heart shattered. Something struck her head. The world spun. And the last thing she heard before darkness took her was Serena's victorious laugh, and the gunfire still echoing somewhere in the estate. Ivy woke in darkness and pain. Her head felt like it was about to split open, and when she tried to move, she realized her hands were bound tightly to a metal chair. The air was thick with the smell of oil, damp, and rust. She was in an abandoned warehouse, light leaking from a few bare bulbs hanging overhead, just enough for her to see old shipping containers stacked around and puddles on the cracked concrete floor. Then she heard crying. Not loud crying, only broken sobs. Mason. Ivy turned her head despite the stabbing pain and saw him curled in a corner, hands tied, eyes swollen red from crying, looking at her in terror. Miss Ivy, she read on his lips. Miss Ivy. Before she could react, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Tall, broad, sandy blonde hair slicked back, eyes icy blue, and the smile of a predator enjoying the hunt. Nikolai Volkov. So you're finally awake, he said, his Russian accent blending with smooth English. I've been waiting for this conversation. Ivy said nothing. She just held his gaze, trying to control the fear crushing her chest. Nikolai tilted his head, studying her like an interesting insect. You know you're the first woman to distract Vincent Corsetti since his wife died. And that's why you're here. You have something I need. I don't know anything, Ivy said hoarsely. I'm just the nanny. Nikolai laughed low and cold. Then he swung his fist and the blow hit Ivy's face like a hammer. She heard bone crunch, tasted blood, pain so sharp she nearly blacked out. But she didn't scream. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. In the corner, Mason cried out. No sound, but he struggled, tried to run to her, his small face wet with tears. A guard held him back, and that hurt Ivy more than the punch. Vincent's safe codes, Nikolai said, gripping Ivy's chin, forcing her to look at him. The locations of his important files, his business plans. I know you know. You live in his house. You sleep in his bed. I don't know. Ivy spat blood in his face. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Nikolai's eyes darkened. He wiped the blood away slowly, then nodded to his men. What followed was hell. They beat her again and again, fists to her face, kicks to her stomach, hair pulled, fingers bent. Ivy screamed, though she tried not to, cried though she tried not to, but she didn't speak. She wouldn't betray Vincent. She'd die first. Mason watched it all, silent, sobbing, shaking violently, eyes fixed on Ivy, though he was terrified. He tried to struggle, but the guard held him tight, and all he could do was watch the woman he loved being beaten before him. Finally, Nikolai raised a hand, and they stopped. Ivy slumped in the chair, face swollen, blood on her lips and nose, body aching beyond feeling. But she still didn't speak. Stubborn, Nikolai said, almost admiring. I see why Vincent likes you, but everyone has a weakness. He walked to Mason, grabbed the boy by the collar, and dragged him upright. Mason struggled, eyes wide with fear. No, Ivy cried, her voice breaking. Don't touch him, please. He's just a child. Nikolai drew his gun and pressed the barrel to Mason's temple. The boy froze, trembling, tears streaming, eyes begging Ivy to save him. Now then, Nikolai asked calmly. Do you want to talk, or do you want to watch this boy die in front of you like his mother did 3 years ago? Ivy had no time left to think. She opened her mouth, ready to say anything to save Mason, even though she didn't know what to say. But in that exact moment, hell exploded. The warehouse door burst open with a deafening blast, and bullets began to fly like rain. Vincent Corsetti stormed in like a hurricane, followed by more than a dozen men armed to the teeth. His gray eyes swept the room in a single instant, searching, and when his gaze found Ivy, when he saw her bruised and bleeding on the chair, something inside him ignited. Not anger but fury, the fury of a beast whose territory and what it protects has been threatened. Vincent fired, dropping 2 guards in a heartbeat. His men flooded in, and the firefight erupted everywhere. Gunshots, screams, bodies hitting concrete. Nikolai released Mason, shoving him to the floor, drew his weapon and plunged into the chaos. Mason crawled to a corner, curling up and shaking as he watched the madness around him. Ivy struggled against the ropes, tried to free herself, but her hands were broken, and her body was spent. All she could do was sit there helpless and watch Vincent fight like a demon in hell. He moved with terrifying speed and precision. Every shot he fired was a life ended. Every step forward was an enemy falling. This was Vincent Corsetti, the most feared Mafia lord in the Midwest, and tonight he hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to slaughter. The fight lasted no more than a few minutes, but to Ivy it felt endless. When Nikolai's men were finally down and the smoke began to clear, Vincent stood among the bodies, breathing hard, eyes searching for Ivy. He started toward her, but Ivy saw what he didn't. Behind him, from behind a container, Nikolai was rising, wounded, blood running from his shoulder but alive, and in his hand was a gun aimed straight at Vincent's back. Time froze. Ivy saw Nikolai's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Vincent still walking toward her, unaware death was behind him, saw Mason watching his father with hope, not knowing the next second he could lose him, like he lost his mother, and she moved. She didn't know where the strength came from. She didn't know how she stood when her body was shattered. She only knew she lunged forward past Vincent and put herself between him and Nikolai's gun. The shot rang out. Pain. Pain so intense Ivy couldn't breathe. She looked down and saw blood spreading across her stomach, dark and warm, flowing through her fingers. She fell, and the world spun. But before the darkness took her, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in 3 years, a sound the world had stopped hoping for. "Papa!" Mason cried, his voice breaking free after 3 years of silence, trembling, terrified, but clear and loud, echoing through the warehouse. "Papa, Papa, Miss Ivy." Vincent froze for a second, his gaze torn between his son's voice and the woman bleeding in front of him. Then the fury returned, stronger than anything he'd ever felt. He turned to Nikolai, who was trying to flee wounded. Vincent didn't speak. He didn't need to. He raised his gun and fired once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, each bullet a silent scream for Isabella, for Mason, for Ivy, for everything Nikolai had taken and almost taken from him. Nikolai fell, his body jerking, then still. Dead. Finally, Vincent's enemy was dead, but Vincent didn't care. He turned back, rushed to Ivy, dropped to his knees in the blood and lifted her into his arms. Her blood soaked his expensive suit, and he didn't care. He only looked into her fading eyes, and for the first time in his life, Vincent Corsetti begged. "Don't," he said, his voice shattering. "Don't leave me. Don't leave Mason. You can't die. You hear me. You can't die." Ivy tried to smile, though. Her lips were red with blood. "Protect Mason," she whispered, so weak he almost couldn't hear. "Promise me, Vincent, promise." "I promise," Vincent cried, tears streaming. "But you have to promise, too. You have to promise you'll stay with me, with us." Mason ran to them, wrapped his small, shaking body around Ivy. "Miss Ivy," he sobbed, his voice clumsy after 3 years unused. Don't go like Mama, Miss Ivy, Miss Ivy." Ivy lifted her hand, touched Mason's cheek, then Vincent's, and everything faded into darkness. The white lights of street. Mary's hospital blazed in the night. Vincent burst into the emergency room with Ivy in his arms, her blood soaking his clothes and dripping onto the floor. Leaving a red trail with every step, he shouted for doctors, for an operating room, for anyone who could save the woman dying in his hands. The staff rushed in. They laid Ivy on a gurney, pushed her through the double doors into surgery, and Vincent was stopped. "You can't go in," a nurse said, her voice shaking as she faced the blood-soaked man with wild eyes. "The doctors will do everything they can. You have to wait outside." Vincent wanted to shove her aside, to force his way in, to stand beside Ivy and hold her hand and tell her she couldn't die. But he knew he couldn't help in there. He wasn't a doctor. He was only a Mafia boss, with blood on his hands. And for the first time in his life, his power meant nothing. He couldn't buy Ivy's life. He couldn't threaten death. He could only stand there watching the surgery doors close and pray. Vincent Corsetti, the man who believed in nothing but strength and power, was praying. He sat on a hard plastic chair in the hallway, head in his hands, his body trembling. Ivy's blood was still on his skin, drying dark brown, reminding him of what had happened, how she'd stepped in front of the bullet for him, how she'd been willing to die so he could live. No one had ever done that for him. No one had ever loved him enough to sacrifice their life. Not even Isabella. Though he'd loved her, she'd never faced that choice. But Ivy had, without a second's hesitation. "Papa." A small voice came beside him. Vincent looked up and saw Mason standing there, gray eyes swollen from crying, his small body still shaking. Marcus had brought him to the hospital right after Vincent, and now he stood there looking at his father with a fear and worry no 6-year-old should have to carry. "Is Miss Ivy okay?" Mason asked, his voice awkward as if he were learning to speak again after 3 years of silence. "Is she going to die? Papa, is she going to die like Mama?" Vincent's heart shattered. He pulled Mason into his arms and held him tight. And for the first time in years, he let himself cry. "No," he whispered, though he didn't know if it was true. "Miss Ivy won't die. She'll be okay. Papa promises." They sat like that for hours in the hospital corridor. Vincent didn't change his clothes, didn't wash the blood from his hands, didn't leave for a second. Mason lay in his arms, exhausted, finally falling asleep. But even in sleep, his small fingers clutched Vincent's hand as if afraid his father would disappear. Marcus came with news of Serena. They'd caught her trying to flee after the attack. She was being held in the estate's basement, awaiting orders. Vincent didn't want to think about Serena now. But he knew he had to deal with her. He told Marcus in a tired, cold voice, "Don't kill her. Death is too easy. Put her on a cargo ship to South America. No money, no identity, nothing. Let her live the rest of her days in misery and regret. And if she ever comes back, if I ever see her face again, I won't be merciful a second time." Marcus nodded and left. 2 hours later, the surgery doors finally opened. "Doctor." Catherine Hayes stepped out, her face tired but her eyes relieved. Vincent stood. Mason woke in his arms, and they both looked at her in desperate hope. "She's alive, doctor," Hayes said. "The bullet went through her abdomen and caused serious damage, but we stopped the bleeding and repaired the injured organs. She'll need time to recover, maybe weeks, but she'll live." Vincent couldn't speak. His knees buckled and he had to grab the wall to stay upright. Mason slipped from his arms and ran to Dr. Hayes, eyes bright. "Miss Ivy's alive. She's alive. Can I see her? I want to see Miss Ivy." The doctor smiled and knelt to his level. "She's sleeping, sweetheart, but you can visit her for a moment." She led them to the recovery room. Ivy lay on the bed, pale, covered in tubes and monitors, but her chest rose and fell steadily. She was breathing. She was alive. Vincent stood by her bed looking at her face, and tears rolled down his cheeks again. He, the cold, ruthless Mafia boss, was crying like a child for the woman who almost died for him. "Thank you," he whispered, taking Ivy's cold hand. "Thank you for staying." Beside him, Mason climbed onto a chair and placed a clumsy drawing he'd made while waiting on the table next to Ivy's bed. It showed 3 people holding hands. A tall man, a dark-haired woman, and a small boy between them. Above them, a bright yellow sun. And below, in crooked child's letters, one word: family. A month passed like a dream, and Ivy slowly recovered in her private room at the Corsetti estate, where she was cared for like a queen. Every day, Vincent sat by her bed for hours reading to her, telling her stories about work, about Mason, about anything that could make her smile. Every night, Mason climbed onto the bed beside her, drew pictures and told her about his day in a voice that was still hesitant but growing clearer with each passing day. The wound on Ivy's abdomen slowly healed, leaving a scar she would carry for life. But she wasn't ashamed of it, because it was proof she'd been willing to give everything for the people she loved. It was a warrior's medal. One evening, when Ivy was finally strong enough to walk, Vincent led her onto the back balcony of the estate. The full moon shone over the garden, turning everything silver. The night breeze carried the scent of roses, and in that moment the world felt like it was only the two of them. Vincent took Ivy's hand, looked into her eyes, and did something he'd never done for anyone but Isabella. He knelt. "Ivy," he said, his voice trembling for the first time she'd ever seen the cold Mafia boss tremble. "I'm not a good man. I've got a dark past. I've got enemies. I've got blood on my hands. I don't deserve you, but you saved my son. You saved me. You showed me that even in darkness there can still be light." He took a black velvet box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a diamond ring gleaming in the moonlight. The ring that once belonged to his mother, his most precious heirloom. "I don't promise life will be easy," he continued, his gray eyes never leaving hers, "but I promise I'll protect you with my life. I promise I'll love you every day I've got left. I promise I'll be the man you deserve. Ivy Thompson, will you be my wife?" Ivy's tears fell, but they were tears of happiness, because she'd lived 28 years in pain and loneliness, thinking survival was all she'd ever have. And now in front of her stood a man ready to give her the world, a boy who needed her, a family waiting for her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Vincent stood, slid the ring onto her finger, pulled her into his arms and kissed her under the moonlight, and from somewhere in the dark a small voice said, "So that means Miss Ivy will be my mama." They turned and saw Mason at the balcony door, smiling brightly. Clearly he'd been watching the whole time. Vincent laughed and pulled his son close. "That's right, son. Miss Ivy will be your new mama." Mason ran to Ivy, hugged her tight, and for the first time called her the name she'd carry forever. "Mama," he said, bright and happy. "Mama, I love you." Ivy held him and cried, and in that moment she knew every pain and every trial had been worth it, because it led her here to this family and this love. 6 months later, Mary's Hospital held its annual charity event, and this year the guests of honor were the Corsetti family. When the doors opened, the room fell silent. Vincent Corsetti entered in a perfect black tuxedo, still intimidating but with something new in his eyes, peace and contentment. Beside him was Ivy, radiant in a midnight blue gown hiding her scar, wearing the Corsetti heirloom diamonds. No longer the thin, exhausted waitress, but Mrs. Corsetti, the woman who'd bled for this family. And between them, holding both their hands, was Mason in a tiny suit, smiling at everyone. Cameras flashed, and someone in the crowd asked the boy to introduce his family. Mason looked up at Ivy, then Vincent, and said proudly, "This is my papa, and this is my mama. She saved me twice, once in a blizzard, and once she saved my whole family." Vincent squeezed Ivy's hand and smiled. "Are you ready?" Ivy looked at the flashes, the crowd, the world waiting for her, and smiled. "I faced a -15-degree blizzard and a Mafia bullet. These reporters are nothing." Vincent laughed, kissed her hand, and together they stepped into the light, a complete family, ready for whatever came next. And that's how a waitress from the slums with nothing but a kind heart became queen of the Corsetti empire. Ivy didn't need money to save Mason in the storm. She didn't need power to love him. She only needed the goodness she'd protected through years of hardship. And in the end, that goodness was rewarded. This story shows that kindness is never forgotten. Even when life is at its hardest, a single good act can change everything. Ivy saved Mason because it was right, and that selflessness gave her everything she deserved. In real life, we might not meet a handsome mafia boss or live in a mansion, but we can all choose to be kind, to help without expecting return. And maybe one day that kindness will come back in ways we never imagined. Thank you for staying to the end. If this story touched you, please like and share it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories. Tell us what this story made you think about. Have you met someone who changed your life or done something kind without expecting anything back? Share with us in the comments. We read and cherish every story. Wishing you all good health, joy, and peace. Remember, no matter how hard life is, there's always hope ahead, and your kindness will never be forgotten. Goodbye, and see you next time.